Thank you very much, and I'm particularly grateful for your very warm welcome and for this opportunity to just share some ideas with you. I really have enjoyed my time in Taiwan. I know I will have a wonderful time here, mainly because of so many good colleagues who are prepared to share their ideas so that we can all learn together. So I'm here really not to preach or to boast about successes elsewhere, but to talk about our problems, how we tried to fix them. Sometimes with success, sometimes actually, despite the bright headlights, underneath the surface it's quite difficult. And as I start to make this presentation, I will use examples from 3 cities, very briefly, to illustrate one point. And those 3 cities are London, Birmingham, and Vienna. The point is about lateral thinking about financing rail and infrastructure development. And although my entire professional background has been spent on regeneration, I spent a period in government as a non-executive director for the Ministry of Transport. And I'd like to explain in the course of this presentation why. And my thesis, my suggestion is that transport and regeneration are twin sisters, and that these 2 sisters must help one another. Okay. So very quickly, 3 illustrations from 3 cities, and then the real point. My first example would be to look at King's Cross Station. King's Cross is just to the north of London. It is probably one of the most important transport interchanges for the whole of London, UK's capital. And this station was built, like much of the UK's infrastructure, by people in the Victorian era. It is old, it was built on a grand scale, but it had very little upgrade or continuous investment for the period since then. It's important to think about King's Cross Station in terms of its railway, transport, and connectivity importance. But it is just as important to think about King's Cross in terms of its land use implications and its physical neighbours. You'll see that the site is immense, but that it's in the centre of a densely populated, highly developed urban setting. So the site is big, but it's in the middle of a very highly concentrated urban development. So making the trains work and run on time is important. But if this site doesn't work, then the whole of this quadrant of London underperforms. And forgive me, because I'm an economist, not a transport engineer, but I've noticed a small tendency amongst transport planners to hold on to large quantities of land, supposedly for operational purposes. And sometimes in holding on to these vast pieces of land, there's not much thought about the value or the cost implications of that land. Of course, I'm speaking about British transport planners, not Taiwanese. So over time, over years, over decades, the whole of this site degraded. As railway management processes became more efficient, they needed less land, and large chunks of this land, large pieces of this site, were effectively abandoned and the buildings in disrepair. And it's at this point that I want to talk about the skills that sit in the private sector that rail managers should consider taking advantage of. Because when the true cost of redeveloping this land was understood by the rail managers, they found out that they didn't have enough money to do the redevelopment themselves. So they reassessed specifically how much land they needed for operational purposes, and then they went to the marketplace with the remaining land and invited partners to join them in a new venture. Next slide. And in producing these are all great questions. Fundamentally, the answers depend on the risk appetite of the landowner, the powers available to the landowner, and the skills and competences available to them. The risk appetite, the powers,
and skill.
and skills available.
第三个是独立持有者他所拥有的权利。
Let me just say a little bit more about each one. So, if I was the owner, in the case of King's Cross, the rail operator did not feel that it had skills to do the project itself, so it vested the land in a publicly owned development company called London Continental Railways. And that company was specifically set up to have real estate development skills within it. And this company was set up at a time when the railway operator was on the defensive. There had been a recent series of very large-scale accidents, and the political environment was one where the rail company was told to stick to operating railways, not playing around with real estate. So the relationship was very much an arm's length relationship, was very much kept at distance. So the railway operator, apart from specifying which land it needed to retain for operational purposes, had no involvement. But the interests of the public sector were protected by London Continental Railways. But the dominant player in the partnership was Argent, the developer. And Argent wisely decided to borrow relatively long-term capital from a pension fund rather than short-term funding from a bank. And so, in terms of risk appetite, in the case of King's Cross, the rail operator's risk appetite, its preparedness to take on risk, is actually quite low. In the case I described later on at Twickenham, actually the rail company feels it has plenty of capability, plenty of powers. It all came about at a later date where the rail company wasn't under political pressure, only to focus on operating the railway. And so actually it was a 50-50 partnership with a construction company and developer called Clear. So different circumstances, different risk management model. But if I were to give you a really blunt answer that relates to the skills and ability of the rail network, rail management company in the UK, they don't really have a lot of experience at regeneration. They're very good at running railway systems. They're not good at running regeneration projects, so really they need partners. And the real skill of the railway company was to make 3 decisions. Which site has value, and how can they release it? How can they protect their financial interests? And realizing this concept called air rights. Not only is there value on the immediate land beside the railway station, There's massive value in allowing somebody to build above the station. In my humble opinion, my guess, what would be the first thing I would look at if I was to be in Taipei for 6 months on an extended holiday and want a nice provocative project to think about in my spare afternoons, I would think about your fantastic metro system and the high-speed rail system. You're creating new stations that create new value, and I wouldn't go for one mega project like King's Cross, but I would, frankly, even before, and I know this is not fair, even before I built the station, I would strategically acquire the potentially valuable lands adjacent to the station. And I would pick 2 or 3 for small-scale commercial partnerships with a Regeneration or development partner, where we retain ownership but share some of the profit. Because my guess is that at some of these stations, new residential or commercial opportunities will flow from the fact that they now have transport. Sorry, it's a long and I'll tell you why my instinct would move in that direction. In the UK, many of our town centres, the retail part of the town centres, are in decline. But one of the areas of retail that is accelerating and improving is transport terminus-based retail. For convenience, people want to do their shopping close to where their transport is. And whether it's dry cleaning, whether it's going to the dentist, whether it's whatever it is, retail and development opportunities within the station perimeter or close to it are very popular, especially as we are trying in the UK to move people from a car-based journey strategy to a mass transit-based journey strategy. Of course, you understand perfectly well, because I've listened to some of your debates, in order to achieve modal shift from car to mass transit, you need to make the fares attractively low. But if you keep the fares too low, you can't meet your operating cost. So to find other revenue sources to keep fares low enough to achieve modal shift becomes quite important in the UK. Whatever alternative, either long-term holding on to land and taking rent, or selling the land in order to get lump sum returns, this becomes a crucial part of the fare strategy in order to achieve modal shift, at least in the UK. About Kaohsiung specifically. I think my answer, Mr. Chairman, is that I like Kaohsiung so much I'd like to understand it better before I offer you
Taiwan has been system. They've been developing a sort of TOD station. What do you say?
Transport-orientated development, I think, is the path of the future. Of course, it has to be done in the right way. And you have to find the right partner. You have to provide the right kind of market provision. You have to work out very clearly whether it's office, whether it's retail, or whether it's residential, or mixed use that can work on that spot. And I think it's important to remember that projects that appear to be a failure in their first 2 or 3 years often turn out to be a massive success in the medium to longer term, because people, of course, people, of course, are very quick to reach judgments about projects that are essentially long-term projects. But in terms of personal experience, what would I instinctively draw on? Well, the last time I was directly involved in a railway extension was in the 2003-2004 period, when I was responsible for an extension to the Docklands Line Railway south of the Thames into South London. And we were worried about transport-oriented development because we saw a huge development potential, but as a new area, we weren't sure what the market would respond to. And so the public sector used its advantages, and we moved the biggest local college to a building literally above the new station in order to guarantee footfall in the first instance. And once the value of the land and the building was established, you could open up floors of it to other market players and get your true value. So sometimes the public sector has the advantage of being what in the UK we call the tenant of last resort. And sometimes we need to deploy this advantage if the market doesn't immediately recognize the value of the opportunity that's being created. Tenant of final resort. Tenant of last resort. So what I'm saying basically is that with all of your political reach, you may be able to persuade another public agency to occupy the building. Or, I'm sorry, this is translated so brilliantly, I'm just going to go for example. Even this month in London, the rail operator for the City of London, Transport for London, has relocated one of his staff offices to Greenwich in a cheap building, but in a new transport-orientated development that's made possible by the railway extension. So sometimes when the market doesn't see the opportunity immediately, we put our own people in, then the area picks up, the value is established in the market, and then the public sector can gradually move out to relinquish its space. Sorry to be.
好，谢谢大家，我是举手。